Okay, good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, everyone, wherever you are. My name is Ayça Çubukçu. I'm an associate professor in human rights and co-director of LSE Human Rights at the London School of Economics and Political Science. On behalf of LSE Human Rights and the Department of Sociology at LSE, I am delighted to welcome you to this lecture and very much honored to introduce our speaker tonight, Professor Etienne Balibar. Before proceeding, allow me to express heartfelt thanks to Mehdi Giles and the LSE events team, all of them, for making tonight's lecture possible. Professor Balibar's talk this evening is the 7th annual lecture convened by the Internationalism, Cosmopolitanism, and the Politics of Solidarity Research Network. As some of you may remember, Professor Robin Kelly of UCLA delivered our previous lecture in 2019 before we had to take a break due to COVID last academic year. Well, Professor Balibar will need no introduction for many of you, but I do want to take a minute to say a few things. Professor Balibar has taught for many years at the University of Paris, at the University of California at Irvine, at Kingston University in London, and at Columbia University in the city of New York. He has published widely in the areas of epistemology, Marxist philosophy, and moral and political philosophy more broadly. His books in English include Reading Capital with Althusser, which was published in English, I believe, in 1970. Then On the Dictatorship of the Proletariat, Race, Nation, Class, Ambiguous Identities with Wallerstein. In 94, Masses, Classes, Ideas, Studies on Politics and Philosophy Before and After Marx, which was one of the first things I read as a graduate student, and it changed my world, especially this particular essay in there, Racism as Universalism. And 95, The Philosophy of Marx, 98, Spinoza and Politics, 2002, Politics and the Other Scene, We, the People of Europe, Reflections on Transnational Citizenship, which was published in 2004, Identity and Difference, John Locke and the Invention of Consciousness in 2013, Equal Liberty, Political Essays, 2014, Violence and Civility on the Limits of Political Philosophy in 2015, Citizenship, and then Citizen Subject, Foundations for Philosophical Anthropology. In 2018, Secularism and Cosmopolitanism, Critical Hypotheses on Religion and Politics. And last year, Spinoza, the Trans Individual. I do wonder, and perhaps Professor Balibar will tell us how he manages to write so much. Professor Balibar—
Just being old, just being old.
Okay, well, Professor Balibar's lecture, the long anticipated lecture tonight, which we've been looking forward to for months, and in my case for years, is titled Cosmopolitanisms, Past, Present, and Future with a question mark. I do wonder about the kind of doubt that the question mark stands for. Perhaps it's doubt about our future, we'll see. Tonight, as you know, is being video recorded. I'm obliged to say that, and we're live streaming now. Technology permitting, we hope to have a video podcast of the lecture and the Q&A posted online by next week. Now tonight, Professor Balibar will lecture for about 40 minutes, and the plan is to leave plenty of time for questions from the audience. The event will end sharply at 7:30 p.m. So it's a tremendous pleasure and honor indeed to welcome to LSE, even if virtually this time. Hopefully there'll be another opportunity, Professor Etienne Balibar tonight, one of the most generous, committed, and for myself, trust-inspiring scholars I've had the pleasure of thinking with and learning from. So without further ado, Professor Balibar.
Thank you. Thank you, Ayça. Thank you so much. This is much, much too generous. But I'm delighted to be with you tonight. I'm delighted to be with everybody in the audience. To be is it's a paradoxical formula. I see a number at the bottom of my screen, which is constantly moving. It was 338, now it's 339, now 341. Okay, that's a lot of people. Thank you all. I'm sorry I can't see you. It's very, I become accustomed progressively, but it's a strange situation. I really hope that we are not entering an era in which there will no longer, or practically no longer exist any live, I mean live, this is live, but any lecture before a real audience in a real aula. But okay. I also want to say how deeply honored I am to be speaking at LSE, an extremely prestigious institution with a long and fascinating history, as most of you know, with great names of professors, students, and other visitors. It's really an honor. And I want to express my gratitude as well, as you did, Ayça, to the LSE events team, that is Nicholas, Maddie, Antigone, and Hoy, and perhaps others as well. Okay, so last thing before I start, remember, Ayça, that you promised you would cut me brutally, if necessary. When I reach, if I reach the time that is allowed for me, and I will stop quickly at that point. So my subject is, yes, cosmopolitanisms with in the plural, and then past, present, future, a rather banal formula in a sense, but you're right, the intriguing element lies in the question mark, which in a sense simply means that at the end of this talk, you won't have something like a simple or final answer. I'm just trying to open a problem, a question. Now, the plural is important because one of my suggestions, one of my ideas is that if we look carefully into the past of this idea, and in a minute I will try and suggest something like a very synthetic or abridged genealogy, we immediately discover that these pasts are in fact many. There's no simple notion of cosmopolitanism, even if, of course, certain traces, certain traditions, certain great names, Kant, for example, inevitable, are still with us, and certainly inspiring many of the contemporary thinkers and public intellectuals who are trying to keep alive and perhaps relive in the present the cosmopolitan idea. Just one name, for example, Jürgen Habermas. This is very clear, and I draw a lot of inspiration from him. But there are other traditions and traces as well. And of course, the fact that the past is multiple leads to the question about the future. Is there a single possibility, a single orientation that can be put under that name? Or should we, in fact, imagine that different types of cosmopolitanisms will be competing in the future as they have been in the past? And the key, or one of the keys to answering this question, so of course, lies in the present situation of the problem. And from this point of view, what I want to suggest is that, of course, the present is multiple, but above all, it is uncertain. It is problematic. It is enigmatic even, because something perhaps crucial or decisive has changed in the conditions in which we can try and address this idea. Before I explain myself on this point, allow me a last quick formal remark. As you will see when I continue the discussion, I take the idea of cosmopolitanism in a rather broad sense, which means that I include intentionally in the genealogy I was talking about, to which I will return, discourses and ideas which do not go immediately or spontaneously by that name. Probably the most important of them is, of these other names, is internationalism, to which I will return. So in a sense, my questioning is as much about internationalism as about cosmopolitanism, which doesn't mean that I identify the two ideas pure and simply. And the question of names becomes also particularly interesting when we look at the tendencies and streams, I would say, of ideas which in the present could represent for us either a continuation or an anticipation of this new cosmopolitanism many of us are looking for, because, and I come to this immediately, the situation has considerably evolved since the problem is located, I would say, and asked in the broad context of what is called today globalization. In a sense, globalization could appear as a kind of cosmopolitanism realized in the real. From another point of view, and I will rather put myself on that side, if we see globalization as a kind of historical transformation of the world, then what we are looking for is not just a representation or an acknowledgement of that situation. It's a possibility to change, of course, to invent alternatives in this world. And for that reason, a number of terms are also circulating. One of them, if we in English, is which I find particularly interesting, is the idea of the planetary, which has been suggested by such eloquent and deep, inspiring thinkers as Gayatri Spivak and Paul Gilroy. If you move to the French, the neighboring country of neighboring language, another difficult to translate, in fact. Another very interesting idea is the idea of mondialité, which is proposed by the late poet and philosopher from the Caribbean, the French Caribbean, Edouard Glissant, as an alternative to mondialisation. So that might be something like globality, but planetarity is better word. Now, for a long time, my contention, my argument when trying to associate the question of globalization with the question of cosmopolitanism has been, and it remains to some extent, that something very paradoxical had happened. You cannot give, of course, an exact date, but something that took place in the last part of the 20th century, when the institutions, I would say, of this global economy and global politics that goes with it began to take shape, namely the extremely paradoxical fact that a more or less complete relativization of borders, unification of the world might appear as a positive and in fact powerful positive precondition for the emergence of something like a cosmopolitics, or a politics that is waged by, of course, parties, groups, etc., but in the last instance by the people themselves at the level of the globe, the world. Something which in German, for example, I was alluding to Habermas a minute ago, is being expressed in the revealing a notion of Weltinnenpolitik, that is a domestic, a politics for which the affairs of the globe, of the world, have become, so to speak, domestic affairs. Now, my contention, as I said a minute ago, goes against this simple and so kind of idea or evidence. I defend the idea that with globalization, cosmopolitanism, at least in its classical meaning or sense, has become at the same time, in a very contradictory manner, both urgent in a sense, and I hope to be able today to give an example of that, of course, by addressing some of the issues raised by the current pandemic. So urgent, necessary, and at the same time, perhaps impossible, or at least extremely difficult to achieve. And if we remain for a minute, another minute at the speculative level, I would say that a reason for that lies in the utopian character, in the very positive sense, in the very affirmative sense of the cosmopolitan idea, at least throughout its history, and in fact, essentially in the modernity. So what is taking place is a kind of clash of the utopian idea with the seeming real conditions of its implementation, something like not the famous or the infamous end of ideologies, but end of a utopia. And so if we want to be a little more precise than that, we have to explain in which sense the cosmopolitan idea was essentially developed as a utopian idea. And I would say that this came from the fact that in modern Europe in particular, when politics and global politics began to be ruled, I would say, by the extremely coercive and in fact violent order of the competing nation states, which, and the classical theories of political philosophy express this through the notion of the state of nature, find themselves, as Kant also will explain, in a state of at least virtual, but also permanent war with one another. With their interests, of course, being represented as incompatible. When to use Carl Schmitt's formula, this becomes the nomos of the earth, then the cosmopolitan idea, which is built around the idea of peace, permanent peace, or perpetual peace, as Kant famously writes in his essay from 1796, appears as a kind of counterpart. This is the description of the ideal world, which supposedly puts an end to the state of war among the nations and relativizes, so to speak, their competing interests. So, of course, in the classical representation, this is essentially based on the idea that a conjunction could be found between the interest of commerce in the broadest possible sense, and that is trade, of course, of different kinds, exchanges among men and nations on the one side, and on the other side, of course, the legal norm with its moral, inherently moral humanist foundation. And precisely when the unity of the, or greater unity of this world of nations, which I would return to, that is of course also a world of empires and colonies, is created, what the power, the moral, affective, and intellectual power behind the utopian idea fades away, and we're left, in a sense, with a brutal reality and no clear way of overcoming its contradictions. So the question is no longer how to unify or unite, so to speak, men or humans in the world, but it becomes how to change, to modify, to convert into something radically different, this type or this form of unity. And that is, of course, our problem today. Now, for this, I believe that we also need to pay attention to several, I'd say, methodological important points, and I will not enter into great details about that, of course. The first is, and I'm deeply convinced of that, in a sense, Ayça was quoting the many books I published. I do not find them very satisfactory, but if there is something that kept me awake, I would say, all the time, it was always the idea that in philosophical matters, and the philosophical matters and the political matters are never really separated, we need to bring together, so to speak, at the same time, acute awareness of the problems that are immediately our problems in the present, what Michel Foucault and others would call the actual. The actuality. We must think in the actual, because this is where, in fact, the questions are coming from. And if you do not receive these questions, you are not, in fact, thinking anything that matters. On the other hand, we need very long and sometimes abstract genealogies. Genealogies of notions. Cosmos, of course, is one of them. Even politics is one of them. We cannot believe that we will invent something radically new by, so to speak, pushing aside what comes from the tradition. And the other preliminary that I believe we must keep in mind is that I was speaking of the nomos of the earth in the Schmittian sense. This is, of course, a very interesting construction because it's rooted in the idea that the earth or the planet, at the same time, of course, is a common horizon within which all our problems are located, but also a system of divisions, distributions, and diversities. So don't believe that we can talk about cosmopolitanism in the same manner, depending on whether we are in London at the LSE or in New Delhi or in Beijing or even better in Wuhan or in Latin America. These places are not to be unified under exactly the same descriptions and the same laws, even if they are continuously influencing each other and depending upon each other. And from this point of view, of course, there's something in the contemporary civilization, I would say, of digital communications, mass media, and behind that, of course, there is also the basis of the powerful global corporations, which make it possible for us all to communicate. I see that there are now 375 people. I absolutely don't know where they are. Of course, we are, in a sense, in the same place, in the same virtual place. But we shouldn't believe that every word that is pronounced resonates exactly in the same manner everywhere. And believe me, I'm deeply aware of the fact that while with some other academics of my generation and learning from people like you, Ayça, and others, I try to get rid of my own Eurocentrism. This Eurocentrism is very strongly and deeply ingrained in my head, and this will become manifest, of course, now when I begin with this abridged genealogy, which is my next step, and I should accelerate. I would very much like to know how similar genealogy is proposed from other places in the world. Now, this abridged genealogy is focusing on the idea that we inherited a certain notion of cosmopolitanism from European modernity. It is from this European modernity I was referring to Kant a minute ago, that some of the most sophisticated and interesting discourses about the cosmopolitan as such, or cosmopolitics, are deriving. Therefore, it's important to reflect on their limitations and also their conditions of possibility and impossibility, as I started to do. Now, what is that modernity? One of the most common, banal categories in our historical and political and cultural thinking. But to be more precise, I'd say, borrowing the category, the well-known category from the late Immanuel Wallerstein, the great American sociologist and historian with whom I had the honor and the pleasure of collaborating for some time. We wrote together the book called Race, Nation, and Class. This is the age of the capitalist world system. And the capitalist world system, of course, is a system based not only on inequalities, but on a fundamental disymmetric distribution of wealth, power, intellectual domination or hegemony between the center, Euro-American center, and the rest of the world, with, of course, a tendency to imagine that history is made in the center and not in the periphery, or only in the form of subsequent and secondary consequences and influences. One of the most remarkable ideas that I inherited from Immanuel Wallerstein was the idea that, in fact, domination is, of course, waged from the center, but changes, decisive changes, are impulsed, I would say, or pushed by events that take place in the periphery. And of course, this became obvious and is now impossible to deny when we consider the transformations that are taking place in this world. But these transformations take us possibly or virtually into another direction, where I have to refer to another thinker, another model, already mentioned a minute ago in my talk, which is proposed by Carl Schmitt. Now, Carl Schmitt, as we know, is not a progressive thinker. He's just the opposite. He collaborated with Nazism. He's the ultra-conservative genius, I would say, of the 20th century. But his idea of the nomos, which means at the same time the law and the distribution again, or the geographic distribution of the earth, remains more than ever, I believe, an extremely important idea. Why? Because it suggests that there are two types of borders or border lines, and the diversity of the world is enclosed, so to speak, at these two different levels behind the borders. There are the local borders or the national borders, which separate nations and or quasi-nations from one another. And there are the global lines. The global lines emerge with modernity in the 16th century, when for the first time the colonial world was divided between the two great colonial powers of the time, Spain and Portugal. And this, they remained, they kept transforming themselves, changing meaning and shape throughout history. So you had different types of binary divisions of the world, which of course the cosmopolitan idea either tries to overcome or needs to make use of. And today, the great question, of course, that we all have in mind, and the situation of the pandemic and the dispute about the strategies that must be used to combat the pandemic, or the possible geopolitical consequences of the pandemic, continuously draw our attention to that, is the following question: are we now entering a new phase of binary division of the world, with an east-west separation, and perhaps, of course, a very important remainder? And I think that we cannot leave this question aside. Now, this modernity is governed by the idea of progress, and it's also for us governed or characterized by the fact that the progress has a dark side. And this is, of course, what we try to reflect about. And it is, of course, something that can be periodized, and perhaps there are different cosmopolitanisms following this periodization. Before modernity, the idea of cosmopolitanism already exists. In a sense, this idea is inherited from a pre-modern age. And the fact, we don't have time to enter all that, but that traces back to the Greeks and the Romans and the Middle Ages. And so I, once again, of course, have to lament the fact that I have no clear idea about how perspectives on the unification, the possible unification or unity of the world could be conceived in the Chinese civilization, or the Indian civilization, or the Ottoman Empire. All this has to do with the fact that the idea of the unity of the world has a very strong relationship to, in fact, the institution or the ideal of empire. And any empire thinks of itself, in a sense, as a world empire. Now, this suggests to us that even from a very remote past, we may have inherited such questions as: what kind of picture of the world do we use? What kind of cosmology? Which form of division of the world or distribution of the world between centers and peripheries or across great global lines do we have in mind? And what kind of relationship is there between a cosmopolitics and an imperial politics? This is not, okay. Now, to finish with that and move to the next point, I will simply say that in this modern genealogy, which I have to describe in extremely quick terms. As I said at the beginning, there are essentially two lines. And allow me, as an old Marxist, I'm trying not to be too Manichaean or mechanistic, to say that there's a bourgeois, or better said, a liberal line. And then there is a would be at least revolutionary, which pictured itself as a proletarian tradition on the other hand. So you have the Kantian tradition and you have the Marxist tradition. And it is not the case that they have nothing in common. This is why, of course, it becomes interesting. Now, the Kantian line is not simple. It is split within itself into different directions. There is a very institutional line, which essentially led at some point to the creation of the Society of Nations and the United Nations. And there is a more moralistic, if you like, line, which also ended with institutional realizations in their recent present, called politics of human rights or humanitarian politics. And then there are alternatives which I have to leave aside. But the important idea at the center of this tradition, which for me is a very positive idea, provided you understand it in a radical manner that is sufficiently radical, is the idea of hospitality. The very core of the Kantian utopia, if you like, is his idea of Kant's idea of hospitality. And I am of the opinion that not only we must push this idea to its extreme consequences, as somebody like Derrida, for example, tried to do, but we must grant it a very important function, not only moral, but political function in today's world, particularly because of the issues of migrations, refugees, and the crossing of borders. In a lecture I gave several years ago, I adopted the post-Kantian title, Strangers, Not Enemies. This is the core for me of the Kantian legacy. Strangers ought not to be treated as enemies. And there's a very strong tendency in today's handling, I would say, of the issues of migrations and refugees to transform in fact, strangers into enemies. This is why it is so important to observe, for example, what is taking place right now at the border between the United States and Mexico, because the new American administration seems to be trying, we'll see what happens, trying to reverse this tendency of making strangers or some strangers, in fact, enemies. And I even add to this the idea that from that point of view, the ultimate goal is not to, so to speak, neutralize the condition of strangeness, but it's to save and to preserve something extremely precious in human civilization, which is the fact that we live with strangers and meet strangers. Now, the core of the Marxian idea it's a little long, but I hope I can make myself understandable. The core of the Marxian line, of course, has to do with moving from cosmopolitanism to internationalism. There are historical details which are very interesting from this point of view. We very often believe that it is in the Communist Manifesto of 1848 that Marx and Engels famously wrote the motto of that internationalism, proletarians of all countries unite. When you look closer at the history of the text, you discover something very interesting, which is that they are reacting to another internationalism, which at the same time is proposed precisely by European liberals, which is the democratic internationalism of the young nations of Europe emancipating themselves against empires. But of course, the most important element is covered by the name proletariat. And of course, that can evoke the working class and so on, but it has a more general meaning. For Marx, at least the young Marx at this time, the proletariat is the universal class. It's the class whose interest can become universalized and be the interest of humankind as such. And of course, the interesting fact in the history of that other cosmopolitanism is the fact that the point of reference or application, if you like, of the this idea of the universal class progressively shifted from one place, I would say, to another. Essentially, it shifted from the center to the periphery. Not without difficulties. I'm simplifying enormously. That partly was the consequence of the failure of the communist revolutions in Europe after 1917, and above all, the transformation of the Soviet state into a totalitarian state, but with complex functions in the world system. And therefore, the new universal class, if you like, became the colonized peoples in their struggle for liberation. Organizations emerged, which were not, or not immediately the Communist Party. The most interesting in my mind, I mean, you have Bandung, of course, but the most, and perhaps because of my age, my generation, is the short-lived tri-continental organization that was created in the 60s and 70s by Fanon before his death, Che Guevara, and others. And the ultimate result of this is the World Social Forum today, which in a sense is a much weaker organization, but on the other hand has the very important function of preserving somehow this kind of universalistic tradition, which is inseparable from the idea that the universal is on the side of the oppressed in the world and not on the side of the dominant, which leads to the last point. I still have a few minutes. Last point that I want to indicate on this point, returning to something I had said in the beginning, namely the idea that for even in the case of the liberal cosmopolitanism, there is always an opposition to empire. And so the question today is, what kind of empire are we living in, or potentially? Negri, of course, and Hart proposed an answer to that. And what kind of alternative can we offer as a recreation at the same time, I would say, of hospitality or translatability, communicability between strangers to one another, and universalization of a certain common struggle. Now I come to my last point, which is, Ayça, please give me a few more minutes, which has to do with the pandemic. Now, of course, this would call for a whole presentation, and I have to be extremely short. But what I want to say is the following. First of all, the name pandemic is extremely interesting and revealing. We know that it is disputed. And interestingly, it was disputed, at least initially, because the very nation or the very place where the epidemic started, that is China, rejected the category pandemic that the World Health Organization was proposing after a relatively short observation of the development of the epidemic. And of course, this had to do with the fact that as a consequence, certain norms and certain legal rules and certain sanitary obligations would be at least virtually imposed. This was a prefiguration of the fact that the development of the pandemic is now producing geopolitical consequences of the first magnitude. Particularly, of course, something like a new, I wouldn't say call it a Cold War. A civil war is too much, but a fierce competition within the pandemic and around the ways to address it among different parts of the world and different powers. The second thing I want to say very quickly is that the pandemic undoubtedly produces something like a higher degree of unity or unification of the human species as such, almost making for the first time the human species a single entity or a single agent, not only a moral idea, but a single entity with a kind of material or materialist unity. Here I am siding with the remarkable and enormously interesting considerations that are proposed by Dipesh Chakrabarti, who has now published, this is the enlarged version of his famous article, this book called The Climate of History in a Planetary Age. But he leaves aside, or he addresses only marginally, the pandemic because the book was written before. And I believe that we can add something to his reflections on this new conflictual unity, I would say, of the human species, which is created by the environmental crisis. Namely, the fact that viruses cross all borders and frontier lines. In a previous presentation that I gave, I said there emerges something very strange, which we could call a traveling couple. The traveling couple is made, so to speak, abstractly speaking, of a virus and a human traveler. So that the globalization, which has irreversible aspects in a sense, has the consequence that people travel from every place in the world to every other place in the world. But now they are traveling not alone and not just with their suitcases, they are traveling with viruses. And these viruses contaminate the people in the other places, so they're perceived as threats. And as a consequence, the traveler himself or herself is also perceived as a threat. Now, as we know, the prophylaxis that is used against this, and I have to be very quick, but we all have this in mind, is a new strategy of isolation. Something very paradoxical takes place. The world is globalized, the world is more unified than it ever was, but suddenly, all governments on Earth erect fences, borders, and now want to install new categories of passports without which you are not able to cross the border. Now, in a sense, this is successful, particularly because less people in this moment at least are traveling. And there are parts of the world that are more isolated than others. China is more isolated than, for example, France or the United States, although they're all isolated. But we also see that this is not a strategy that can be pushed to the extreme consequences and to the end, because there is no way in which you will, in fact, absolutely make it absolutely impossible for viruses to travel. So if the Chinese isolate themselves entirely and they carry to the end their own politics of vaccination, what will happen? the variants from Brazil or from South Africa or from Africa, Central Africa, the coming variants, where the vaccines are not distributed, and this is of course an important part of the geopolitical inequalities and situation, will come back with a vengeance. And those who had isolated themselves will find themselves more vulnerable to the viral threat. Therefore, of course, the logical consequence is not the solution is easy, not no lockdown, no isolation should take place, but something like a combined, of course, something like combined and regulated, perhaps planned sanitary policy must be implemented, which is exactly what the World Health Organization is calling for every day. But at the same time, and they are a cosmopolitan institution in a sense, but at the same time, of course, when they are calling for that, they are also drawing our attention to another side. This is my last point, another side of this situation, which is the increase of inequalities and exclusions. So the unity of this world, passively and pathologically created by the pandemic, is at the same time riddled, I would say, with increasing divisions and conflicts. And if we had time, of course, we should spend a lot of time, more time to show, but we all have this in mind, and we can read it in good newspapers almost everywhere, how different the effects of the pandemic are on different social groups, across gender lines, racial lines, geographic lines, of course, of development and under developments. And therefore, I dare, using this perilous category, creating or recreating, in a sense, something like quasi-races. They are not defined by their DNA, but they are defined by their relationship to the pandemic in the world. So the final question would be, and I leave that perhaps for the discussion, which idea of the cosmopolitical do we derive from such a description? And here, of course, I do believe that we need something like speculative answers. That's why I was quoting Dipesh Chakrabarti, because Dipesh Chakrabarti uses the philosophical category of the subject. So I would say the question is, what kind of subject is the human species becoming in the framework of the global climate crisis, and more specifically in the context, I would say, of this global pandemic? How do we move? Which dialectics, which negation of the negation, to put it in Hegelian words, can help us understand a transition or promote a transition from the passive unity I'm describing and something like an active participation of every human in the determination of their own present and future history. This is a deep philosophical issue which I put on the table and leave aside to just say that politics here is not just the marginal aspect of the question. In a sense, it is the center. It is through a political reflection and discussion that we may perhaps advance the philosophical issue. And for that, we need notions, and we need perhaps not programs, but mottos or objectives. So which notions do we need? The World Health Organization has proposed a formula which I find quite remarkable. One world, one health, and to this I would gladly add one species in relationship to others, of course, because the cause and the health of the human species, we are now convinced, is not independent from the condition and health of other species on Earth. The very idea of crossing the species barrier as a cause of the pandemic makes it very plain. The logical consequence of this idea, one world, one health, is the promotion of the notion of global public goods. And health is, of course, generally speaking, a global public good. And particularly in this moment, the vaccines are, I would say, the major stake in the definition of the global public good. Hence, the first motto that we need to promote, I would say, and there are organizations and public intellectuals and activists who push in that direction, even some politicians, heads of state, but they speak about it. And in a sense, they do exactly the opposite, namely the deprivatization of vaccinations. And the second and last, I know I'm done. The second and last idea that I want to promote is the idea of non-discrimination. Planetarity in Spivak's and Gilroy's sense is, of course, a regulating horizon, I would say, of communication and even creolization or hybridization between different cultures and different traditions. But that makes sense, of course, only if it goes along with a resistance, a systematic resistance to discriminations of all kinds. And among the discriminations, there is one which is particularly dear, I would say, to me and others, and which I maintain in the current situation. It's the discrimination in circulation rights. And I insist on this point because I had spoken of hospitality before and universalism. And of course, among the privileged victims, I would say, in a sense, of the strategies used against the pandemic today are precisely the migrants and the refugees. Sorry for the thanks. I stopped there.
Thank you very much. Virtual applause. I have lots of questions.
Oh, yes, I'm sure.
Mostly about the resort to the category of humanity in the context of imperial processes that we're trying to understand in the 21st century. What are the risks of using the human species or humanity as a mobilizing concept in our current predicament, given all kinds of discriminations that are effected through the category of humanity? So I will pose that, but I would like to read some of the questions, Professor Balibar, so you could perhaps pick.
Yes. Yes.
A question from Sandro Mezzadra from University of Bologna.
Oh, Sandro is here.
Yes, he's here.
Sandro, you should talk instead of me. You know so much more.
And his question is, I would like to expand a bit more on what you called, with reference to Schmidt, a new phase of binary divisions of the world as a prospect emerging from the current conjuncture. Which kind of relation do you imagine in particular between such binary divisions and the entrenched processes of logistical and infrastructural integration that cross the line between East and West? So this new phase of binary divisions of the world, what is the nature of this division? And I think it relates to my question about humanity and its divisions. So let me see, one more question from Yasin Sunja.
From?
Yasin Sunja.
Yeah.
Asking, where is the location of the radically different? Is it in the decolonized planetary interconnection or in the materialized and globally inspiring experiences in localities far from the contemporary core? I'm having particularly the Zapatistas and the Rojava Revolution in mind and their internationalist engagements in mind while asking this. The internationalism of the Zapatistas, the Rojava Revolution. And if I may tag on to that question, if you could articulate a bit more for us, what are the dividing lines between this Marxist tradition of internationalism, perhaps embraced by radical social movements still, and a liberal cosmopolitanism, which has no problem, I think, endorsing the World Health Organization, for example, as the solution to our problems. So one more question, and from Elena Loisido from Birkbeck College Law Department. She's asking if you have thought about the term mutual aid to think through hospitality and internationalism, which is rooted in the anarchist tradition. Kropotkin in particular. She says, I'm saying this because mutual aid groups made their presence felt during the pandemic. I think they continue in some way the utopian project of cosmopolitanism. I will leave it at that. Those.
Yes.
We have 28 minutes and more questions.
No, I mean, I'm sure there are other questions waiting. Okay, yeah. So I should not spend another hour on these questions. Yes, and although I didn't let you cut me as I had promised I would, now you will, of course. Okay, these are extraordinary questions. These are the questions I am trying to investigate or to ruminate in my head. Let me take them in the order. I mean, so I'll remain, of course, very quick and simple. First of all, regarding the category of humanity, I see no reason why we should drop the category humanity. I would not deny that the category humanity is used and rooted in a certain sense in hegemonic discourses which either ignored or covered or even legitimized fundamental forms or regimes of discrimination in the history of the world. But I believe that there is an insurrectional side, if you like, to the category of humanity. I think the category of humanity is a place, is a site, so to speak, is a conceptual and intellectual site of permanent conflict. So the question is not, in my view, of course, is not whether we accept it or reject it. The question is how we use it, for which purposes, and against which other concepts or conceptions of humanity. And from this point of view, of course, such issues as formal rights versus material freedom, or different concepts of equality, etc., are right in the middle and relevant. I beg you. I mean, Ayça gave a long record of my previous writings and so on, to put aside or leave aside the idea that Marxists like myself trained, I would say, in the so-called anti-humanist Marxist tradition of the Althusserian brand, are completely foreign and deaf, I would say, to the importance of the category humanity. Marx himself, and Ayça, I know, has a great interest in that, proposed in his early works, the 1844 manuscript, a remarkable notion which has Hegelian roots, of course, which is the notion of the species being, the Gattungswesen. Humanity is the Gattungswesen, is the species being. I believe that this notion is receiving, I would say, in the current situation because of the twin problems, and that's what Chakrabarti writes, the twin problems of the environmental crisis, better said, I believe, catastrophe, because we have crossed the line of irreversibility. And now the more specific, but in a sense more immediate issue of global health, it receives a new meaning, and we need to re-elaborate it. But the content, for me, the practical content, is not some ideal worshipping of the idea of the moral idea of the human, just to say something like we're all in the same boat, or we are all the same humans. It's to practically address the issues that I was referring to at the end, namely the fact that the unity does not go without the division. And that's okay, my idea. Second, Sandro. Sandro, thank you so much for being here. I think I have to send the question back to you, because the logistic is something that you've been working with and publishing with Brett Nielsen in a very elaborate manner in all your recent work. So I will simply say that I referred to Schmidt because I had the disturbing impression, and I'm sure you agree with that, that the globalized world in which we live today is less than ever a world which is in fact homogenized or homogeneous. And the great Schmittian idea, of course, from a conservative point of view, is there is always in fact a bipartition with a remainder. And so the question becomes, which is the bipartition that is going to be dominant, or that will create our main problems in today's world? Mentioning the logistics, of course, I know that you have in mind the idea that the North-South divide is of course not suppressed, although we are also all aware of the fact that the line between the North and the South has become an extremely complicated one, because there is much North in some parts of the Old South, and we are aware of the fact that there's a lot of South in what used to be considered the North. But these are complications. This line still exists more than ever, and it has to do with the fact that so-called extractive capitalism is still, of course, very much with us, including in the form of the so-called environmental debt. I found it very interesting reading recently Amitav Ghosh. I'm sure many of you have seen that. I have the French edition here, The Great Derangement, in which he explains that the situation is extremely perverse, because in a sense, of course, it is the North that has produced over centuries, or in the last 2 centuries, in fact, the greatest amount of pollution and CO2 which lead to the environmental catastrophe. But the tipping point was the fact that towards the end of the 20th century, China and India embraced the course of rapid catch-up and industrialization, and adopted the kind of logistic that was that they imported from the north or from Europe and America in order to compete. And this is what, of course, quantitatively has accelerated, I would say, the catastrophe. But the question of the East-West, divide is not a question for which I have a solution. It's a question that is haunting my mind because I read around us in the critical studies, etc., either discourses which define neoliberalism pure and simply in terms of what we observed in the last period in our Western capitalist countries, or that remain, and rightly so in a sense, pure and simply governed by the idea that the main conflict is between the colonial North and the colonized or ex-colonized South. Whereas, of course, the emergence of China as a world power, perhaps a hegemonic power, or in any case a power that competes with America for hegemony, completely disturbs this pattern. This is what your master and friend Giovanni Arrighi had anticipated, but the consequences to me are at the same time huge and very open. Sorry, this is too long. I have to. So Rojava and Zapatistas. Oh yes, thank you so much for referring to that. I'm very much of the opinion that these seemingly local alternatives are in fact of universal importance. And of course, I find it very important in this respect that both in the case of Comandante Marcos already some time ago, and more recently in the case of Rojava, in a tragic manner, we have to admit, because they are resisting, but they are besieged by very, very violent enemies in this moment. This universal dimension was explicitly formulated. Now, whether the kind of local self-government, autonomy, and cultural originality that these experiences are developing itself can be adopted everywhere, certainly not. There are local inventions. They're rooted in a long tradition of struggles and resistances. But the important fact is, of course, the fact that they resonate across the world. I agree that this is an important part of the new cosmopolitanism, and probably also, I'm very quick, one that helps relativizing the gap, or the apparent gap between the liberal and the cosmopolitan and the proletarian or internationalist brands of cosmopolitanism. They have something in common, which is democracy. Now, of course, democracy itself is a site of conflict and struggle, and all these experiences you are referring to are, of course, trying in a very interesting manner to push democracy beyond the limits of bourgeois democracy or pure formal representation and equality. But this is not discontinuity. It's a continuity. I dropped the idea that I had defended virulently when I wrote a book on the dictatorship of the proletariat. I do believe that there is a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, but I don't believe that the alternative is a dictatorship of the proletariat, which drops the requisites of bourgeois democracy, pure and simply. Rosa Luxemburg was right on this point. What you need is progress, not break. Finally, my dear Elena, mutual aid instead of hospitality. To some extent, it's a question of convention and names. Now, there is something, I agree with that, in the category of hospitality, which is problematic. And I have participated in many disputes about that, which made me aware that there is a problem. Because on one side, in the Kantian tradition, and even better when you push it to the extreme, following somebody like Derrida, who speaks of unconditional hospitality, you stress, you emphasize the importance of this motto without reservation. Strangers are not enemies. I believe that this is very important. On the other hand, there are people around us and activists, and particularly militants in NGOs who work with refugees and migrants, who are reluctant, who are with respect to that term, because they perceive something like a paternalistic element. So the hospitality, which is exactly what Derrida tried to reverse, but that's a long discussion. They believe that the idea of hospitality is something like there are the established people safe in their home and country. They should be generous. That's what more or less Joe Biden is trying to propose now after the horrific xenophobic policies of Trump. It remains that America appears as the generous, powerful place where the poor and the victims of exploitation and expulsion and violence in other places must be received and accepted. And this is not, of course, a concept, this is not a radically democratic concept. So for that reason, I tentatively want to combine this idea with something that my friend Sandro Mezzadra, who is here tonight, has not only theoretically, but also practically implemented and explained many times, and which is the idea that the resistance against expulsions and destruction of the migrants is not the initiative of one side, but can be only a combined agency, I would say, and practice, in which, in a sense, those who help and those who are helped are on the same footing and par, what he calls the autonomy of migrations, which I understand as the migrants are not just victims that we are helping. They are political subjects with whom we try to elaborate a strategy against the current world order. And in fact, when he and his friends in the Mediterranean send the rescue boats, the Germans or the Italians, some French as well, the rescue boats, which against the police and armed forces of all European countries, and the pirates from Libya, etc., reach to the boat people to save them. In a sense, they are extremely hospitable, but in the other sense, they are trying to contribute to the emergence, I would say, I wouldn't say of a proletariat, but of a new emancipatory movement, which is rooted on both sides of the border.
Thank you, Professor Balibar. I'll raise two more questions. We have about 8 minutes. One is from Mark Meany.
From Mark?
Meany, I believe, M-E-A-N-E-Y. And the question is, by relying on the WHO, on WHO, and therefore on a form of institutionalism, are you not advocating on
No, not the WHO, not the WHO, the WHO, the World Health Organization.
That's right, WHO.
Yes.
And therefore, on a form of institutionalism, are you not advocating on behalf of a Kantian notion of cosmopolitanism? Pure and simple, I guess the question is. And the other question is by Adriana Garriga Lopez. She's asking, how might we think the difference between decolonization as a national versus a planetary project?
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. So we have exactly 8 minutes. And I'll close the session after that.
Okay, so I have to be very brief. Yes, thank you for referring to the WHO, as I did myself. I know. Okay, I think the role and the function and the status of the WHO in this situation is extremely interesting. And that there is an element of institutionalism here in my discourse, and probably in the fact, is completely true. I mean, it's completely true. Is it Kantian? Perhaps it's ultra Kantian, you know. The problem is that Kant moved from a completely institutionalist understanding of the idea of cosmopolitanism, which in fact was a kind of legacy of the tradition of the idea of the global state, that was before the French Revolution. And of course, he did not identify it with the universal empire, but it could not perhaps be totally separated from it. And then, of course, as a consequence of many things, especially the events of the revolutionary period, he moved to the final version, which is the one that we all discuss, read and discuss in our classes now, this idea of the cosmopolitan right, Weltbürgerrecht. And when you read the text, you see that this right is not exactly legal. That's one of the great difficulties. It's somewhere in the transition, the uncertain and problematic transition between a purely legal system, which for Kant goes with coercion and with statist institutions, and a simple moral idea. So in a sense, Kant does not resolve practically the problem that he's asking. Perhaps because he lacks a concept of politics or cosmopolitan politics. I would be tempted to say, what is it that is neither law nor morality, pure and simple morality, although it can have a foot on both sides? It's politics. It's politics, it's collective politics. But I agree that this politics must have an institutional horizon. So I'm very much against a purely anarchist position. So I'm not with my friend Rancière. I'm not not even with Tony Negri's idea of the constituent power that never becomes constituted. I believe that the institutionalization is a necessary dimension of this kind of politics. And again, the World Health Organization is itself in the middle of the conflict, because on the one hand, it is pure and simply a creation or depending on the United Nations, and the United Nations are a completely statist realization of the cosmopolitan idea. So it derives its inspiration from Kantian ideas, but in fact, it's controlled by the states. And then we find ourselves in a situation in which the spokesman for the World Health Organization, that is, his name is difficult, Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, who seemed to be, in the beginning, a kind of instrument, I would say, in the hands of a certain powerful state, emerges, like it or not, as spokesperson for the interest of those who are left aside. And he does that in two important manners, which are correlative. First, a warning, if you believe that you can preserve, addressing the powerful state, China, France, European Union, the United States with all their mess. We see that in Europe today. If you believe that you can have an isolated policy of immunization, you'll be the first victim in the long term, because Africa and South America are the places where the variants proliferate if the pandemic is not stopped. And if the variants proliferate, your vaccines are not efficient or not enough. And then the second thing he says, of course, he says, I'm aware of the fact that it is not simple to deprivatize the production of vaccines, which is has been produced by the combination of public research and private cooperative investments. This is not easy. This is not easy, but this is necessary. This is necessary. Otherwise, the distribution will remain absolutely unequal. So we must find the solution. Who is that we? Well, that's the whole question of the political agency. And Adriana, decolonization and planetary. It is true that I am very admirative, I would say, of the way in which Spivak or Gilroy, or in writing in French, somebody like Glissant, write about the post-colonial situation and discourse. So perhaps you may think, I hope not, but you may think that the old white male speaking to you in this moment prefers a discourse that seems to be more, it's not conciliatory, but more inclusive, I would say, inclusive, rather than just adopt the idea that the anti-colonial struggle is continuing in our countries today in exactly the same form in which it took place in the previous era. I hope it is not as simple as that. But so I don't see any compromise on the question of racial discriminations, for example. And if this were necessary, the effects of the Black Lives Matter movement in America these days should remind us that there is a strong antagonism that is not terminated. But the situation at the same time is not is one in which cultures and traditions and histories need to become hybridized, I would say, in a new manner. So if this combination, if this hybridization is a code word to explain that the hegemony of the Western culture is going to last forever, in that case, it's to be rejected absolutely. But if the idea is that radically new forms of commonality and translation are to be, and multiple identities are to be created as precisely the hegemony changes place or changes meaning, I believe that there is something very creative and productive in this notion of the planetary.
On that hopeful note, thank you very much, Professor Balibar.
Thank you. I'm sorry that I'm so...
To the audience for joining us. We have upcoming events which will be announced now. Thank you all for coming, and hopefully there'll be another chance to continue the conversation and perhaps even face to face. So good evening, everyone. Thank you.